America's Book Club host David Rubenstein and author Walter Isaacson viewed the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution in the Rotunda of the National Archives.
So when this building was built, it was built to house these documents, but unfortunately, from the archives point of view, the documents were in the possession of the Library of Congress.
Right.
And the Library of Congress said, over my dead body, am I giving these documents up? Eventually, Truman sent a tank up to escort the documents back here.
You know, one of the things we've talked about is that the first draft of the Declaration that Jefferson wrote is still in the Library of Congress.
Correct.
The final document is here. They've never been shown together, but the people here said for July 4th of this coming year, they're going to try to show them together.
And this rotunda is very dark, and the reason it's dark is to keep the documents from fading. It is a urban legend that the original documents here, the Constitution and the Declaration, are subject to going underground if a nuclear bomb goes off.
I think that's from some movie or something.
I don't know, but who knows? They don't really tell you if it's true or not.
So, but they stay here all night, right?
They're here all night, and but I assume there's just some way to preserve these documents if some attack were to occur. But and this is, in my view, the single greatest place in Washington D.C. to talk about the country's history, because very often I've spoken here, right here. You have dinners right here. You've probably been to many of these.
I've been to one where you spoke.
Right, and you basically hear about the history of the Declaration and the Constitution in front of the original. So it's fairly inspiring to people who have never actually been here before.
Tell me about the architect.
The architect was John Russell Pope, who was a very famous American architect, but trained in Italy. So he loved big columns, and so he did the Jefferson Memorial. He did the Daughters of the American Revolution Hall. He designed this one. This has the biggest number of large columns in the world of any big building. I think it's 72 big marble columns outside, or granite columns outside the building. The building was originally built during the Hoover administration, and it turned out when World War II came along, they needed to fill in the inside of the building, because there was like an arcade, not arcade, a park in between, around the building, inside. But they had so many documents coming about because of World War II that they had to fill it in, so there's no real inner space where people could walk around on the inside of it in terms of a garden or anything like that. And then it outgrew this after a while. The reason they have this building is this. When the country was set up, each government department would hold its own documents. And the buildings were often built by wood. And the wood often burned down. So lots of times the documents that we had in the early parts of the country were burned. Somebody came up with the idea, it was in the early part of this 1800s, we should actually get something built here, for all the documents to be in one place. It took about 100 years to get it done. The Congress finally passed the law, I think in 1929, that would create the National Archives, and they began building the building in 29, finished in 32, I think it was, and Hoover laid the cornerstone, but then he left office, and then Roosevelt took over. He fired John Russell Pope, brought another architect in, and ultimately the building got finished. And today,
it's not just for display, though, because I've been here, and they actually have great archives that you can go through, including if you're writing about the Declaration or the Constitution.
They do. They have incredible history. I lent them. This is where I've put my copy of the Magna Carta. It's here, and so they have it here, and this is where the previous owner had it as well, Ross Perot. So it's an incredible institution, very inspiring. It gets about 2 million visitors a year to the National Archives, something like that. So this is the original copy of the Declaration of Independence. It's faded beyond recognition. The reason is it was folded up many times and put in storage. When the British were invading in 1814, this was put together in a package, and it was buried in Leesburg, Virginia, hiding it from the British. Ultimately, it was put on display at the Patent Office for about 30 years in a row and faded a lot. Ultimately, it was decided that we would have perfect copies made, and so replicas were made. This was not signed on July the 4th, despite the fact it was agreed to on July the 4th, because on July the 4th, the British were invading and controlling New York, and therefore the New York delegation couldn't come to vote for this. So they said, here's what we'll do. We want to get it in gross copy, clean up the text. We'll get it in gross copy, and then we'll have the delegates come back in early August. It was signed between August 2, 3, and 4 when delegates came back to sign it. And signing it was not that easy a thing to do because it was treason. So when they adopted the document on July the 4th, nobody's name went on it. Right. So nobody had committed treason publicly. The British didn't know who signed it. When they came back in August, they did sign it, but it wasn't released publicly until I think January of the subsequent year, because there had been some victories and maybe people thought it wasn't so likely that the United States would lose. But anyway, it wasn't revealed publicly until I think about January of 1777.
You know, it's the famous John Hancock done in quite bold, because he was the president of the Continental Congress when it was signed. But the famous story is, he says, you know, that with so many forces divided against us, we must all hang together, as he signs it. And Benjamin Franklin says, most assuredly, we must all hang together, otherwise we will hang separately, because they knew it was treason.
It's true. It's true. Hancock was a revolutionary businessman, very big revolutionary leader. At the time, the biggest revolutionary leaders in Massachusetts who were fomenting a lot of the revolution were John Hancock and Samuel Adams. John Adams, who was his younger cousin, wasn't quite as famous at the time as Samuel Adams had been. And then when the British came in 1775 to kind of thwart the rebellion that was beginning, they came largely to arrest Samuel Adams and John Hancock, who escaped. But it was Paul Revere, when he was trying to tell everybody that the regulars were coming, that's what they called the British, he was really trying to warn Hancock and Adams that they were subject to being arrested, so they better go hide out or escape. And they did.
Wasn't it Samuel's cousin John who proposes the motion in the Continental Congress for independence?
He drafted it, and the motion was that delegates go back to their states or colonies, get permission to separate and come back. And so they had to go back for a while, and then they came back. But John Adams became a bigger leader at that part of the Second Continental Congress. He wasn't as well known to the public as Samuel Adams had been early on, but then later John Adams became better known.
You know, John Adams thought by proposing that resolution he would be famous for the one who declared independence.
Right.
And so he's on the drafting committee with Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, and 2 others to do the declaration, but he lets Jefferson do the draft, and then I think was quite resentful for the rest of his life that Jefferson got credit for the declaration.
That's right. Jefferson was picked to be the author by John Adams. There was a 5-person committee, and Jefferson was asked by Adams to do it. Jefferson said to Adams, you should do it, you're a bigger leader. He said, no, I'm from Massachusetts, we should have somebody from Virginia. You're younger, you're a better writer than I am, and also people don't like me and people don't dislike you. So he drafted it. Adams and Franklin, as you know, edited it. Later, it became a source of rivalry because Adams, as you know, didn't think that it would be that big a deal. He thought the big thing was the resolution to get out of the bonds with England, and the declaration was seen as a propaganda document. It wasn't as significant, it wasn't a legal document. But in the end, we celebrated the Jefferson document so much that Adams resented it. And one of the reasons we celebrate it on the July the 4th is this. The day that we voted to be independent was July the 2nd. That was the day we voted to be independent.
On the Adams resolution.
Adams resolution. That night they took up the declaration drafted by Jefferson, and they finished approving it on the 4th. So they were very happy, and then when the next year came around, July the 2nd, 1777, they were going to have a celebration. But they were so busy they forgot to celebrate the date. So they got organized, and they got around to organizing themselves, so they celebrated on July the 4th. And Adams was upset. He said we should be celebrating the 2nd, which he was responsible for. And Jefferson wasn't upset that it was the 4th. But Jefferson was upset with the editing of the Declaration, so much so that he wouldn't admit he was the author of it for 9 years.
Right.
He just thought they had, quote, mutilated his document. Later, as you know, on his epitaph, he wanted to have this as the most important thing he'd done.
Right. It says July 4th, 1776 right on top.
Right,
so it does make that date a little bit more exciting than July 2nd. But of course, Adams and Jefferson died the same day, right?
Yes. What happened was they had a rivalry, and for the latter part of their lives, they didn't get along very well. And in part because Jefferson ran against Adams for president. He won in 1804. It was 1800 he won. And Adams was so upset, he left town before the inauguration, didn't stay to see Jefferson sworn in. They then didn't have any contact for the rest of their lives physically, never saw each other again. But about a few years before they both passed away, Dr. Benjamin Rush kind of brought them together through a letter writing campaign. And they then wrote about 100 letters or so between the two of them over the latter years of their life. And then on the last day, July the 4th, 1826, they're both very ill. Adams says on his deathbed, Jefferson still lives, or something to that effect, when it turned out Jefferson had died a few hours earlier.
On the
Adams didn't
50th
know
anniversary. On the 50th anniversary.
50th anniversary. And people saw it as a sign from Providence that the two great men of the era had died on 50 years to the day that they had done the Declaration of Independence. So maybe it was Providence, who knows?
It's very interesting. As you say, Jefferson was furious at Congress for editing it, and Dr. Franklin is sitting next to him and tells him a somewhat long story about a hat maker who wanted a sign done, and he said, hats made for ready cash. And they kept saying, why do you need ready cash, whatever? And finally, he just ended up with the beautiful hat, and he said, Jefferson was told by Franklin, I never allow myself to be edited by committee.
Right. Well, yes, you wrote that in your book on Franklin.
Well, one of the things that would be great is for people to understand the first draft of the Declaration, which is currently in the Library of Congress, and just see step by step by step how it got to this. It was June 21st, 1776, that Jefferson finishes the first draft. He's living on Market Street, and he writes a beautiful letter to Benjamin Franklin. So, with the good Dr. Franklin, with his great wisdom, peruse this and give his edits. And having been an editor, I'd never seen such a nice note to editors before. And Franklin sits there with him and Adams in the house on Market Street, and they go through the 5 drafts.
And it was written originally, it is sacred and undeniable. And
He began by saying, we hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable. And you see Benjamin Franklin's printer's pen with the backslashes, heavy backslashes he used, and he crosses it out and puts self-evident instead of sacred, because he wants to convey that our rights come from rationality, not the dogma of religion. Right. But the sentence goes on, and there's John Adams's handwriting. In Dowd, he puts in, by their creator. And Jefferson puts creator in lowercase, and finally they get creator in uppercase. This is why, looking at the editing of these documents, it'd be great to display them together someday.
Tell me the difference between unalienable and inalienable. It's always confusing. What word is actually in the Declaration?
I think Jefferson begins in his drafts with inalienable, certain inalienable rights. And somehow or another, as it gets transcribed, including by John Adams, who makes a fair copy of it as they're presenting it to the Congress, it gets changed to unalienable. And I can't quite figure out the difference in the words. They're pretty much the same. I think it may just been a transcription error. But if you look at the Jefferson Memorial, it has it his way, inalienable, but in the final copy, it's unalienable.
There was somebody who transcribed it. See, when they agreed to the text on July the 4th, and it was printed, they later had the engrossed copy, engrossed by a man, I think his name was James Matlock. He actually engrossed it, and he may not have read it properly.
He may have read it. It's great how a typo can be part of a national creed. But at least the words mean the same thing, and it means you can't take away our rights.
Right.
This is amazing, and these are the most profound 3 words you can imagine beginning a document with, which is we, the people. Because for the first time, it was a contract that wasn't the rights come from conquest or for tribalism or from the divine right of kings. It's we, the people.
Now, that wasn't the original draft, though. When they were thinking about it, I think they were saying we, the people of the states, or we, the states. Yeah. And then they came out of a committee. They had a committee that was supposed to clean up all the parts, and it came back from the committee, we, the people.
It's one of the natural tensions. That's a glorious tension in American life, which is to what extent we're a democracy of the people and to what extent we're a federation of states. And of course, they were wrestling with it back then, and we're still wrestling with it now. But they begin the document with "we the people," and it just means every citizen, not every person, but mainly white male landowners. But eventually that gets expanded, and "we the people" becomes an expansive concept that more and more people, women, blacks, minorities, all get included into.
Yeah, at the time, there were probably, 3 million, 4 million people in the country, but what they were really giving the rights to were white Christian property-owning men.
It's one of the great contradictions, whether it's in that document with "all men are created equal" or "we the people," and you have a Jefferson who has enslaved 400 people at the time, and as you know, it's complicated. He doesn't free most of his slaves. Tell me about that.
Jefferson actually, early in his career, thought that slavery was abhorrent, and he proposed getting rid of it. And his proposal was to send the slaves west of the Adirondacks, basically live there. And he then realized if he had a political future ahead of him in Virginia, that wasn't going to fly. So he stopped talking about it the rest of his life, really. He owned over 700 slaves during the course of his lifetime, and he was very meticulous in counting how much money he made from each slave. And he died almost bankrupt, but he would have been bankrupt a lot earlier had he not had slaves.
And he has children, of course, by Sally Hemings, one of the enslaved people. He makes a deal with her that the children are freed upon his death, but she remains enslaved, right?
Yes, upon his death, he went along with the agreement he had earlier struck with her that he would free their children. They had 6 children together, most people believe. The DNA evidence mostly shows 4 of them lived to adulthood. They were freed upon his death, and 2 of them later moved to Ohio and lived as whites. They were so light-skinned they could pass as whites. Sally Hemings was not freed. The reason was probably this: she wanted to stay in Virginia. And in those days, if you freed a slave in the same state in which she was a slave, that would have to be approved by the legislature. So Jefferson no doubt knew that the state legislature would have to approve her staying in Virginia, and that would raise all the issues again about her relationship with Jefferson, and he didn't probably want that. So ultimately, she wasn't freed, but Jefferson's daughter more or less freed her, and Sally Hemings lived the remainder of her life in Charlottesville. We don't know what she looks like, and we don't know that she never left any writing behind, because most times slaves could not read and write. It was illegal in Virginia to teach a slave to read or write. And so
let me add that Benjamin Franklin started a school for freed slaves in Pennsylvania to teach them to read and write. So there's a great difference between some of the founders.
That's right. But Franklin, did he not have one slave at
He
one
had
point?
2 slaves when he was a young printer, and he realized at some point how abhorrent it was, and they kind of wander off, and he doesn't pursue them. And in the end of his life, to make up for it, he feels bad that this happened. He becomes the president for the Society for the Abolition of Slavery in Pennsylvania.
Now, Washington had a fair number of slaves. His wife had even more slaves. Upon his death, Washington freed his slaves upon the death of his wife, because his wife didn't want people who were slaves realizing that when she died, they'd be free, and maybe they would facilitate her death. She freed them sooner than they would otherwise be freed. Washington had the view that slavery was not a very efficient economic system, because his view was, I have to take care of all the slaves after they can't work anymore. And so when you add up all the money I'm putting into slavery and all the ones who aren't all that productive, it's costing me more than it's saving me. So while he never freed his slaves while he was alive, and he did try to capture slaves who escaped, he didn't actually think as economically it was as wonderful a system as people thought.
In the Declaration, when it says, all men are created equal, that's, of course, very controversial when Jefferson does it, because he's enslaved up to 700 people in his life. And what he's taking it from is the Virginia Declaration of Rights. And George Mason, who was also a slave owner, had written, all men are created equal. And they amended to say, when they enter into society, political society. And that was a way to exclude slaves from being considered as equal. Jefferson didn't put that phrase in. He just wanted it to be simple, all men are created equal. And it sort of becomes, as Lincoln at Gettysburg says, we're dedicated to this proposition, and thus it becomes a driving force in the more inclusive America.
Well, when the Declaration of Independence was released, initially they printed 100 copies. One was sent to King George, one was sent to George Washington to read to the troops, one was sent to each state. The people in Britain, they were outraged at the idea that they had forced slavery upon the American colonies, which was in the document originally. But it was even more hypocritical, they thought, for people to talk about their rights that they were entitled to when the United States employed slavery, and the British mocked it.
Although, let's make it clear that even in Britain, there was a complexity of views about the slave trade.
That's true, and they had slaves in other colonies as well. And
all 13 colonies had slaves by 1776.
that's right.
So.
And Britain itself didn't outrule slavery until the 1800s.
Right. You say 100 copies were made. And it was by John Dunlap, is it? The
Dunlap
printer?
was the printer.
And Franklin, who had been a printer in Philadelphia, picks the font, a William Caslon font, for that Dunlap version. And they send it around. Tell me about the Dunlap versions.
Well, Dunlap was a printer. He had printed other things for the Continental Congress. And he printed this from the draft that they had, the marked up draft, that now I think is in the Library of Congress. You print it up, and there are 100 copies printed. Now there are probably 23, 24 left. You have a book out now on, it's called The Most Famous Sentence in
the greatest sentence
ever written. Okay, greatest sentence ever written. And I think your book is in the same typeface as Dunlap.
Absolutely, you caught that, which is when Franklin goes over as a young teenager to England to become a printer, he brings back this Caslon font. William Caslon was a great type cutter there, and Franklin loved it. So when they do the Dunlap version, he says, do it in Caslon font. And so I said to my publishers for the greatest sentence ever written, do it in Caslon font.
And why is it the greatest sentence ever written?
Because it becomes the common ground and the creed, the mission statement for a new nation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, and that all men are created equal. And that is something that not just is a declarative sentence about the country, it's an aspirational sentence. And as we go into the 250th as a very divided country, if everybody could just read that sentence and say, okay, this is our common ground, I think it would bring the temperature of our political discourse down a bit.
Well, hope you're right.